literally the definition of the word overcompensation for safety comes to mind when you look at this thing. And when I first saw it, I was actually quite impressed at what they pulled off. And looking at the ducts and the way it was designed, I was very interested to fly this thing and see what the flight performance was like. Real quick, let me go over the quad. So it's a Diatone quad. It's made by Diatone. Their development quality is actually pretty surprisingly good for the price point that they enter at. It's got Mamba components in there, obviously. It has this frame, which is kind of the main point here. It's got a foam cutout, which goes all the way around the whole entire quad, except for the front and the back. And it's got carbon that goes on the top and the bottom with a 3D print in the middle of the whole apparatus. These carbon fiber duct areas are connected to the main body on the top and the bottom. So when you get this thing and you hold it in your hand and you try to flex it and bend it, it's not absolutely rigid, but it is far more solid than you would really ever assume for a super duper mega Cine Whoop thing like this to be. It's using 1408 motors, which are pretty hefty size motors, and it's using the props that Gemfan has designed specifically for ducts. And I'm not going to get too real quick, flight performance. This thing surprisingly flies pretty reasonably well. It is an absolute chainsaw in the air. I run it on a 1300 milliamp 4S battery with this my GoPro Session on board, and it performs shockingly well. The throttle control is right on point. It just weighs a little bit much. It's about 305 grams dry. In the configuration I flew it in, it was about 560 grams, which pretty much all of these super duper mega Cine Whoops are going to be. But the throttle control wasn't wonky. It was overweight, and the lower 20 to 30% of the throttle really does nothing at all. But overall, you do have pretty good throttle control. Now, don't try to do anything crazy with dives and whatnot. It will give you crazy yaw washout, and it is pretty dramatic. But all in all, the flight performance of this thing is impressively good for what you're looking at. Now, the actual control of yaw, roll, pitch, whatever, is not the best. Obviously, it's got all this weight on the ends of the quad with all this stuff everywhere. But again, the flight performance of this thing is surprisingly good. But now let's talk about the actual duct and duct design. Now, I didn't bring out the other duct designs that I have, but something that a lot of people have noticed or recognized about ducts is that it kind of makes it feel like the quad is locked in one position, in one altitude. So let's look at the actual duct design. If you look, there's a video by Bruce from forever ago, which he talks about how ducts work, and I would highly recommend watching that if you haven't already seen it. I think almost everybody in this hobby has seen it. And he explains how ducts actually generate more thrust than not having a duct, because the shape of the duct, the rim of the duct, actually acts as an airfoil, and it gives you a high and low pressure zone, and it gives you more thrust. Now, it does take a little bit more amps and a little bit more energy out of the quad in order to generate that more thrust, but hey, you are genuinely getting more thrust. Now, if you shrink down to the whoop scale, things get very different, and in many cases, whoops actually fly better with the ducts rather than without the ducts, but I'm not getting down to there. What's most interesting about this particular size class, in the 3-inch size class with and without ducts, is that there are ways to do it with prop guards, safety, all this stuff, and having ducts or something on board at the same time. Now, this is actually one method that I had come up with to do it, and I'll explain to you why I personally believe the throttle control is not wonky on this thing. But before that, the props that were designed specifically by Gemfan for ducted whoops or ducted quads are designed such that they run very close to the actual rim of the duct, and that's required in order to generate the force necessary to kind of get the added thrust that you want, or just maximize the effect of the duct or having ducts on. In return, these props are literally the loudest props you will ever hear on a quad because of how jarringly sharp the ends are and how blunt the whole prop is. Then you stick it in the middle of a duct, and it just kind of it This is literally the loudest quad for its size that I have ever flown. So loud, I got literally every single dog in the neighborhood barking, and I could not fly for longer than a minute because it's just not acceptable to fly something this loud in anywhere that people that are unknowing exist or live. Anyways, if you look at the shape of this duct, it doesn't actually have a rim at the top. It has a symmetrical design from the top and the bottom. The bottom is actually curved out and the top is actually curved out as well. So you kind of have a net zero effect as the air rushes through this duct area. And I think that is what's allowing it to have pretty good throttle control. Now, there are a number of other duct designs, and here is one by Stan FPV. And he has sent me a bunch of ducts. I could not appreciate it more because this is going to be a very interesting test of multiple ducts. This is a pusher quad duct, and you can definitely see this design on the edge of the duct, which is kind of like a curve, and it sort of has an airfoil-like shape if you kind of spun an airfoil around in a circle. This is another version of the same design, which is just regular with the props pointing up kind of duct with some prop guard protection on top as well. And the reason I have these, or I asked them for these, is because a number of people told me how awesome his ducts are and how they work so miraculously well. So one thing I actually hate about most Cinewhoops out there is that it feels like your throttle is kind of locked. Your altitude is sort of locked. And I have a theory as to why that may or may not be. It's just an idea, just a thought, just kind of, I woke up one morning and I had this random thought. The way this works is by having air rush down through it. When you have a forward velocity, you have air already rushing through it, in addition to the thrust of the prop pushing the air through it as well. So you kind of have a double effect of this thing acting sort of like an airfoil and giving you a little bit more thrust than it may originally have given you. If you try to slow down and in turn reduce your throttle rate, the velocity of the air going through the duct doesn't actually change as quickly as you want it to. So the prop can't actually slow down the air. It can just slow down itself and expect the air to also slow down or just not have as much of an effect. So I think that the reason why your altitude feels locked when you drop the throttle is because you can't slow down the air fast enough. And the reason why it feels locked when you try to increase the throttle, for the same reason, you can't accelerate the air fast enough to generate that sort of an effect. So you get this kind of buffering effect on the duct. And the other issue with ducts in general is that it does require a whole lot of energy from the motor, from the quad, to be able to manage and maintain the attitude of the quad. So that's why you get these weird washout effects, because you literally are chopping off the top end of the RPM range. When you take the ducts off, you get better performance, but that's arguable because these things are not really designed to fly in the typical super crazy acro kind of style. They're really just designed to float around. And for that purpose, I literally do not know of another 3-inch quad that can carry a GoPro that could potentially be any safer looking, or more durable than this quad. So fantastic kudos to Diatone for this wild design. I actually do like it. However, my own design for a Whoops and a Whoop kind of a thing is quite a bit different. It'll be seen pretty soon, but it's interesting. It's very interesting to see the differences between all of the various mega Cinewhoops that are coming out now, because they all actually perform very differently, and based on the motor you use and the powertrain and everything that you're using, everything performs differently as well. It's really not that difficult to get one of these things to fly reasonably well, since they're not really designed for you to go crazy on them, but it is difficult to get really great fine-tuned control out of them. And so that's obviously something that I look for, but again, in this kind of a class of quad, that may be a moot point. You may just need something that can fly and carry a GoPro and have mediocre control at best, and most importantly, it must look safe. And that is probably the single most important aspect of all of these kinds of super duper mega whoops, is that they must look safe. You could technically still hurt someone quite badly with this thing if they get hair or a finger or something caught in the ducts, but it looks super mega safe because it has super duper, I mean, if you knock this thing in someone's head, it's not it's not really going to hurt them. You just got to disarm to not suck anything into the ducts. So interesting. I'm also going to be testing other kinds of props on this. I'm also going to be testing a number of other super mega whoops, as well as the Stan FPV ducts. I have them in 3-inch, I have them in 4-inch, and I'm really looking forward to testing this stuff kind of a lot, because it's just very interesting to see how different they are, because they all do actually fly very differently, but they all share the same issues in general that ducts present, which is difficulty of RPM. You just don't have the top end of the RPM because the ducts restrict so much airflow. The noisiness, unfortunately, they're all rather noisy unless you have a very thin little prop guard, not so much of a duct. And I'm just going to leave it at that. There's a lot of things I'm working on, and it's just going to be really interesting. Take care. Floss your teeth. Bye.